Kim, we recently talked about small observation hives and how enjoyable they are. I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about the big guys, the ones that live with you, and how enjoyable they can be.
Yeah, I've had those in the past. Never in my house, but in a store. But there's a lot I'm sure I don't know, and a lot has changed since I did it. So, what do I need to know?
Yeah, well, I want to talk about what little bit I know. Hi, I'm Jim Tew.
And I'm Kim Flottam.
And we're coming today from Honeybee Obscura, where we want to talk about the big observation hives and sometimes the big problems they can bring.
You are listening to Honeybee Obscura, brought to you by Growing Planet Media, the folks behind Beekeeping Today podcast. Each week on Honeybee Obscura, host Kim Flottam and Jim Tew explore the complexities, the beauty, the fun, and the challenges of managing honeybees in today's world in an engaging and informative discussion meant for all beekeepers, long-timers, and those just starting their journey with bees. So sit back and enjoy the next several minutes as Kim and Jim explore all things honeybees.
Right off the bat, Kim, I want to say that these big hives can be big problems and big successes, and that it's all going to be your decision. There is no standard model. I said that even with the small units. These things are always unique. The way you open them, the way you close them, the various features they have, none of them are standard. Some of them are furniture grade, others are remarkably crude.
Well, the one I had experience with was 3 deep frames, and that was it. One on top of the other. So it was 1 frame wide and 3 frames tall. But I've seen those that are, 3 frames tall and 10 frames wide, sort of things, that big. So if I'm going to have one in my house, I'm thinking probably 3 frames tall and 2 frames wide. Is that a good size, or is that not big enough or too big?
No, I feel you're asking me like I'm some kind of authority. That's certainly a common size. The things that right now some of the listeners are just chomping to say is that if you have double frames or if you have inside combs, then the queen's going to hide there. She's going to preferentially stay there, and that's true. So if your goal every day is to see the queen for whatever reason, then you don't want those combs where they have an inside, only 1 frame deep. Then other listeners right now are eager to say, well, if you don't have them at least 2 frames deep, then the bees can't even form the semblance of a cluster, and they're never going to be happy in that box. And the reality is, they're never going to be happy in that box anyway, even if you do have 2 frames or 3 frames side by side. A glass wall observation hive is not anything natural to them. So anything you do is a trade-off. I would be happy with 2, 2, and 2, the way you just described, or even 1, 1, and 1, depending on what you wanted to show.
Well, basic information. Where, how close to the window does it need to be? And how do I orchestrate the opening from the hive through the window so they can get in and out?
It's always miserable, Kim. I mean, it's just, when you say that, it's just painful. When I put an observation hive, I had it put in my bee lab, we had to have the special people come in who could cut a hole through the infrastructure that held the safety glass in the wall. And then later on, when they had observation hives put inside the building, they had to have people come in and physically bore holes through the wall. So this is a major undertaking to put these things in permanently. But more commonly, you're going to put them in at a window. And then you would raise the window slightly, put a board underneath that, drill a hole in the board. But then you got the window slightly raised up top. So basically, Kim, you do whatever you're qualified to do, or you do whatever you can pay somebody else to do for you. So getting that entrance and exit may be a headache for you.
Well, I'm thinking I'm not going to drill through the window frame. I got all brand new windows a couple of years ago, and they're metal, and That's not going to happen. So it'd have to be that idea with the board makes sense. I could use that most of the year, but when it gets really cold in the winter, I'm going to have to do something else. Of course, when it's cold in the winter, like it is right now, I'm looking at about 16 degrees and 14 inches of snow out here today. When I'm looking at that, your bees aren't going to be outside anyway. So I could close it down but they're going to want to be outside the day after tomorrow when it gets up to 40. So
strange things happen, and I don't know how the bees deal with it. How can they deal with it being 68 degrees inside and 16 degrees outside?
We do it.
We do, but we control the thermostat. If you're an animal, you're an insect, how do you set your thermometer? I mean, if it's 16 degrees outside, it should almost be 16 degrees inside, except for your cluster. But anyway, I don't know. It's one of the marvels of bees that somehow they figure out that there's something weird going on here, but it's very cold outside.
Well, you bring up another question immediately. When we were talking about those small hives, you mentioned ventilation. So I got 6 frames of bees in this glass box. How much ventilation do I need really? And can I overventilate?
All right. This again is my experience with large observation hives, some that I built, some that I bought. I wanted a lot of ventilation. So I had 3 deep frames on 3 deep frames on 3 deep frames. I had 9 frames total, 3, 3, and 3. And then on the end, each one, I had a 3-inch hole that I bored through the uprights. And then up top, there were also 3 3-inch holes. One was a feeder hole. So I had major amounts of ventilation because I would want that much ventilation if I were a bee. And Kim, those bees went to work almost immediately propolizing those screens closed, to the extent that I had to put the screens on the outside so I could take them off, melt the propolis off, and put it back on, because I was convinced that the bees were going to, for lack of a better term, suffocate themselves inside this box, chock-a-block full of bees with no ventilation.
Yeah, I can see it. So you got to have something in the bottom to draw in fresh air and something at the top to expel the warm, moist air, just sort of like a wintering hive.
One would think, and now you've touched a nerve you didn't mean to touch. So if you move to the door of your house and crack it just open a little bit, you can feel air either coming in or going out. I didn't realize that when I put that observation hive in my bee lab, and it drew, it siphoned, it pulled air from the outside through the observation hive and vented it. And the bees were going crazy trying to stop that because they were living in this rush of air being drawn into the building by the heating and cooling system. So the way I've gotten around that was to make an 8-mesh tunnel that went in the entrance tube so it would shunt that vacuum draw. Otherwise, I had this air flowing through. So when you said air from the bottom, air from the top, all those things were true, but it was not a gale force, but it was a lot of air being pulled through.
Well, I'm thinking of bees in a tree. They've got an entrance usually on the bottom and nothing on top. So, well, I can see where it's going to start getting complicated. And one more thing that you got to think about, they're not out foraging, or are they out foraging? Yeah, they probably are. So what about feeding? Do you need a feeder? Most bees sometimes need feed. How did you organize that?
Yeah, I always had feeders up top. You'd think it's an observation hive. I'll just open it. I'll put a comb in. I'll do whatever. Opening that hive was always a huge deal. When you've got 3 frames, 3 deeps on 3 deeps on 3 deeps, it's got several thousand bees in there when it's really filled up. So to open the thing, you'd have bees that become roaring out of the whole wall of the hive is open. So it was always much easier when they needed feeding just to feed them up top. So I've cut a hole that would take a typical jar feeder, and I fed them up top as they needed it. I never found a good way in the one that I built to feed a protein substitute. I had almost no way to get it in. I tried to squeeze it through the hardware cloth. This is not working well. So it was easy to feed syrup. I had a greater problem feeding protein substitute.
Yeah, I can see that. I've seen pictures of some that had a feeder right by the side of the box, right kind of, you had to go underneath the feeder to get outside, and you could put a jar on that, or you could seal it in. You could put a cap on it and put some protein patty in, but the bees had to go right under it to get outside.
Better Bee is pleased to sponsor today's episode of Honey Bee Obscura podcast. For over 40 years, Better Bee has supplied beekeepers across the country with the tools, equipment, and knowledge needed to succeed. Because many Better Bee employees are beekeepers themselves, they understand your needs and challenges and are better prepared to answer your beekeeping questions. From their colorful catalog to their support of beekeeper educational activities, including this podcast, Better Bee truly lives up to their tagline of beekeepers serving beekeepers. See for yourself at betterbee.com.
Well, how do you deal with varroa?
You know, I didn't say that a bit ago when I was discussing the protein substitute, but it's the same thing treating for varroa. If you're going to build an observation hive, when I built the one I'm talking about, there was no varroa. But you need to build in some way for, I don't know, whatever system you're going to use, installing strips. If you're using oxalic acid, some way to vaporize that.
Tricky.
You've got to work in some way. Or, since you can open it up, you can do something dramatic. I guess you can open them up, physically take them out. It's going to be miserable doing this, Kim. This is a horrible idea. Put them in a deep hive body, take them 3 miles away, treat them for varroa, bring them back 3 days later, and put them back in. You must not have any other life, Kim. You got nothing else to do if you're going to spend all this on trying to do so. You got to figure out some way to treat them. Or the reality of it, and my reality of this is, do you think they're going to overwinter? You think 9 frames is big enough to overwinter? It's not practical. Right around 1st of November, you need to break that thing down, put it away. It's going to get ugly. They're going to have bees defecating inside the colony. You're going to have an ugly partial death and a huge mess to clean up next spring in most cases. Just break it down.
Well, you've got ahead of me a half a step here, because you got a small, relatively weak population of bees, and something that small hive beetle just loves to find. So you're probably going to have an issue with small hive beetle in there.
Well, you do. You have an issue with everything in there. At least you can see your issue.
That's true.
If you stand there long enough. I do want to say this. I would stand there for hours, Kim. And I wrote about it in bee culture occasionally. What are these bees doing? I label these bees, and one group of bees, stargazers. They would almost put their head flat up against the glass, like they were looking up to the heavens, if they were on a flat surface. And they did nothing. I mean, they were figuratively standing there smoking a cigarette. I mean, what are these bees doing? That here's one over here, here's one over here. I have no idea what they were doing. And bees would jostle them and walk over them, and they would not be dissuaded from their work. They were looking upward.
Sound asleep.
So I'd love to stand there watching what these bees were doing, or trying to figure out what they were doing.
Well, if I got one of these in my home, and I've been watching them, and I've been lucky so far, haven't gotten varroa or small hive beetle, just day to day, do I keep those glass sides covered? I mean, do I open them up on special occasions? Otherwise, keep them covered. A sheet of styrofoam or something on the side, so you got a little bit of insulation and it's dark. And is that a good thing to do?
Well, everything you said, I agree with, and that's exactly what I did. I had a piece of styrofoam, 1-inch styrofoam, on each side, and when I was not viewing it, I would close it off. No doubt there was still light getting in all the way around at the cracks, but at least it darkened it a lot.
Yeah.
And I did it for some insulation purposes. I did it for some darkness purposes. I wanted the queen to come out as much as possible to use those outside frames, just so I could watch what she was doing.
And watch what happened after she laid that egg or those eggs and the process of going. Well, you've handled feeding. And they can get outside, so they're foraging probably, so they're supplying some of their own food. But if not, you got a feeder set up. You've got pest control. You can see, and if you have to, you can take it out and treat or redo it. You've got ways for them to get rid of dead bees from inside. Undertaker bees can carry them up. What else am I missing here that I need to be thinking about when I put one of these up in my living room?
I don't know if you set me up for this or not, but there's one thing I want to jump at. We all discuss that odor that bees make when they're putting up honey in the fall, coming in from aster and goldenrod, that strong, pungent odor.
Oh.
If you're living with a big observation hive in your house, they will move you out of your house. You can't stay in the house when they're bringing in that sweet stink from those fall asters and goldenrods. It's stunning. I have a 9-frame observation hive I've been describing behind this wall on an enclosed porch, and I can still smell that thing in my shop for about a month when they're producing that honey. And I'm thinking, I don't know how you'd live with it. I mean, the air is just thick with that. So whatever those bees are doing in your house, you're going to be living with it. So if they didn't close those vent holes, you're going to be living with bee hair and, bee parts and pollen and the odors that comes in with that. You're living with a wild animal in your house. It needs to be a wild animal you really want to live with.
Well, we did a thing a while back on the smells of beekeeping. I'm going to have to go back and review that because one of them we did was good smells and the other one we did was bad smells. So
yeah,
could I live with those bad smells going on in my house? I think maybe you've just changed my mind here.
Well, I didn't mean to change your mind. I'd put it in your garage. I'd put it out there near your chickens and then, go stand there with a cup of coffee and look at the bees, and then they stay out there with your chickens and you go back in your house. So you live near, but you don't live with. There's a difference.
Okay.
Keep them out of the sunlight. You got to put blinds up, whatever it takes. If the afternoon sun hits it, goes through the window, hits that observation hive, you're going to kill your bees.
I bet I could put them in with the chickens. There's a thought. I can take care of everything in one trip. Okay, well, there's something to think about. Hey, this has been fun, and I appreciate the information, and I'm going to think more about this, but where and how big and all of those things I gotta wrestle with, so appreciate your help.
I'm happy to do it. I hope you consider getting an observation hive.
Okay.
Well, let me talk to you about it, but I really like it.
Thanks. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.